Okay, ladies and gentlemen, best of order, please. If we could ask everyone to quieten down a little bit, thank you. I know that I've got a big mouth. Some people have argued I don't need the microphone. Mainly my friends. Okay, thank you. On behalf of Trust in Yellow, can I really welcome you all to this phenomenal event. The Bingham's Boys, the Heroes of 66. We're very fortunate to have many of those heroes here tonight. Just a little anecdote before I pass you on to someone who can say an awful lot more about this than I can. You. Apparently, when the game was televised, as you're going to see later, the highlights were televised, the BBC paid £25, a princely sum of £25 for the privilege. Now the club at the time, and I wonder if the chairman is in the room, because this might be an idea for future games on BT Sport, I'm sure the lads will appreciate this, wanted to pass that money on to the players. But FA rules apparently prohibited this, as it was not in the normal bonus structure. So it gives you a little bit of an idea of how football has changed over the years. We're going to have a few things tonight. We're going to have an opportunity to actually view the match of the day highlights from the game. We'll meet all the players and we'll have a Q&A. You'll have the opportunity to ask the players your questions. But first of all, to give us some real context, pass you on to someone who knows it all, the club historian, Jeff Wild.
Good evening. One minor correction. First, I'm not the club historian, that's Michael Graham. I'm the club statistician, so it should really be Mike who's standing here talking to you, I think, but never mind, I'll do it. Just one marvellous moment that I've just had there, introducing Dino Mountmere to Bill Bingham. Wonderful to see our current manager. Really quite thrilled to meet probably his most illustrious predecessor here. It was a great moment, that. Right, that's nothing to do with what I'm going to talk about initially, because the theme of this is background and context. Well, that's the background. Okay, let's start with that one. And as for context, let's just remember that we're here to celebrate the 50th anniversary of one of our greatest cup runs ever, but don't forget that it's not our all-time record. Because going back another 35 years before that one, we got to the 6th round of the FA Cup in 1930-31. We were in the last 8 with Exeter City, who were the 3rd Division South team. We were 3rd Division North. We were the first 2 3rd Division sides ever to get that far in the FA Cup. Now, we wanted to have some of the 1930-31 players here tonight, but unfortunately there were problems with the exhumation orders and things like that, so unfortunately none of them are here. But Mike Graham and I did have the privilege of meeting a few of them when we were going around in the 70s and early 80s, tracing old players. And in fact we met 5, well I met 5, Mike wasn't with me when I saw Billy Baker, the goalkeeper from that team. But we did see between us 5 of the players from that season, including the great Archie Waterston, who that year set up the club all-time scoring record, which wasn't beaten until Terry Ferns beat it in a recent season. But Archie Waterston, you have to remember, only joined the club on October the 20th that year and got his goals in what was effectively just 2/3 of a season. But he was still around, and we saw him up in Scotland, where he lived. Tommy Holmes, who lived in Darlington, I saw him a few times, he was a great friend. And George Wyness, Jack Little, of course, who lived in Southport latterly. Well, he stayed in the town after he played here. He came from the northeast, he was from Right Montine. And of course, Jack Little's grandson played for us in the Port Vale Cup tie in the late 80s. That was Graham Rowland. So there was a connection there between 2 cup sides. And there's somebody else, I think I've forgotten, who played in that. There were 5 altogether anyway from that team. Well, in that season we beat the likes of Millwall in the third round and Blackpool in the fourth round, who were a big team at the time, and Bradford. And then we went out when we played Everton, and the least said about that result, the better really. But it was another game which shouldn't have been played. There'd been heavy snow on the pitch, and it had melted that morning, and it was an absolute quagmire. And Southport didn't play very well at Goodison Park that day, I'm afraid. But my father saw the game, he was there, and also my grandfather, and my mother's father, went along to the game together. My grandfather was supporting Everton and my father Southport, but my grandfather had the better of that day, certainly. Anyway, that was the season that we had our best run ever in the FA Cup, although the one that came along in '65 certainly ran it close. In the meantime, it's also appropriate to think of something that happened 60 years ago, right now actually, because in 1955-6, at exactly this time, we were top of the table in Division 3 North, jointly with Accrington Stanley. And that's a position that we've not reached too often, certainly not in the Football League days. And a fortnight afterwards, on February the 25th that season, we actually went top of the table on our own. But in the last 2 months, we slipped back a bit and we weren't around to take any advantage of it and move into what was then the second division, and now it's called the Championship, of course. So for 2 or 3 weeks in that season, we were actually lying 45th best team in the country in the tables. It's appropriate we mention that now, because we're celebrating something that happened just 50 years ago, and that happened just 60 years ago, as it turns out. But unfortunately, the team that did so well in that season largely stayed together the following year, but weren't anything like as good with the results. And there followed 2 or 3 really dire seasons in the late 50s. I can remember results where we lost here to Hartlepool 6-1 in one game. We also lost 8-0 at Walsall. We lost 9-1 at York City. These weren't consecutive weeks, but over the next few years we were getting some terrible results. And things didn't pick up really until, well, really it was the season that Wally Fielding was manager here. He brought in 1 or 2 youngsters from Everton, and he was sacked at the end of that season, and the managership was taken over by Lem Newcombe. Now, Lem had been a player here just before the war, in the last couple of seasons, and played a bit into the war years when there was regional football. But since then, he'd run a sweet shop and tobacconists in Southport. And at the age of about 60, he came out of retirement and took over the managership here, and put together a side which everyone remembers with a great deal of affection, particularly Blaine, Blore and Fielding, the 3 inside forwards in that team who, not particularly tall any of them, but my word, they could run about and score a lot of goals. And then put a side together which was a blend of some 1 or 2 older players and some new younger ones. And while he was here, he brought in people like Alan Spence and Alex Russell. I don't know what happened to them actually. If anyone remembers anything about them, it would be interesting to know where they are these days.
One's over there, one's over here.
Oh yeah, I've heard that before. And also Tony Beanland, I think, came in while Lem was manager at Southport. And the nucleus of a side was coming together, but unfortunately in the season 1963-4, Lem Newcombe took ill, and in the close season of 64 he died. And the next season the managership was taken over by Willie Cunningham, the Scottish international who played for Preston North End, who was coming to the end of his career, and he came along as player manager. But that season didn't work too well. He did introduce people like Colin Alty. There's another one I often wonder what happened to him.
Les Dagger.
I wasn't going to mention Les Dagger, but that season again finished in disarray really. Cunningham got sacked. A lot of the players finished their careers. I mean, we'd had Roger Darvel, the centre half, for 7 years, and he came to the end of his career. Albert Harris, the goalkeeper, retired also that season, and we were down to a nucleus of a few of the younger players, some of whom I've just mentioned, and without a manager and really not knowing quite where to go. It was at that point that we advertised for a trainer coach, and Mr. Bingham applied for the job, and everything started to change. So that's the sort of point that my little introduction finishes. But I would just like to stress that it's just as well to mention the 4 people who were in the Cardiff City Cup tie who aren't here tonight because they've now passed on. Alex Parker, who Bill signed shortly after he came here, was a tremendous player in defence. He was sort of marshalled the whole of the defence and got it working wonderfully. He'd been Scottish international, he'd signed from Everton, and he died just a few years ago up in Gretna Green, where he ran a pub up there. And then Brian Reeves, who was one of the best goalkeepers we've ever had, was another signing that Bill made, and he was ever present through the 65-6 season, had a tremendous season, and certainly I know Mike Graham reckons that he's the best goalkeeper he ever saw at Southport. I'd put him in my top 3 certainly. And then there was little Dickie Marshall, who was possibly the unsung hero of that season. Only slight of build, but quite nippy up the wing, and contributed an awful lot to the team, laying on goals for other players. He got 1 or 2 himself. Dickie, who I actually visited out in Los Angeles when he was working and living out there back in 1987. And I always remember, at the time I was driving around California in a rented car, and there'd been a lot of drive-by shootings going on in Los Angeles. Guys just pulling a gun on another driver alongside them and shooting at them. And Dickie had a couple of cartoons based on this, which he gave me copies of. One I particularly liked, where there's one of these shooting incidents that had just occurred. 2 or 3 cars pulled over at the side of the road, and there was a cop leading a guy away in handcuffs, and a reporter was interviewing another cop at the scene, and the policeman was saying to the reporter, yeah, he said, we got him for shooting a .44 in a .22 caliber zone. So that was all they were concerned about. Anyway, Dickie sadly died only about 5 years after I saw him, at the age of 46, and had a heart attack after playing tennis with his son one morning, and just fell on the floor and died. And lastly, but by no means least, Arthur Peat, who played right through the 1960s under several managers, managed the side himself briefly as well, was a tremendous worker, clocked up the most number of league appearances of anybody for Southport in the Football League, 401, and only just left before the season when we won the championship in 72-3, which was a great shame really. But he died just 2 or 3 years ago, and had lived in the town ever since he played here. And whilst we're paying tribute to the 7 of the players from that season, and the others who, like Les Barrett, who played at Stockport County and scored that memorable goal, we must also just remember the 4 that can't be here tonight. So that's me finished. So thank you very much for listening. I'll pass you back to Noel.
Ladies and gentlemen, our club statistician, let's get it right, Mr. Jeff Wild.